Hello, everyone, and good evening. On behalf of the Friends of Fondren Library, thank you for joining us at our annual reception to honor Rice authors and editors and composers and artists. My name is Carl Caldwell. I'm the Samuel G. McCann Professor of History here at Rice University. My co-chair for this event is Professor Matthias Hense, the Isla Carroll and Percy E. Turner Professor of Hebrew Bible and Early Judaism. We'd like to welcome all of our members and all of our guests to tonight's event, the first such event which has been held under conditions of COVID. Tonight, we're going to honor those members of the Rice community who have contributed. Sorry, I've received notice I have no video, and I'm going to stop my video now. I'm going to restart it. Do I have video now? Thank you. Tonight, we're going to honor those members of the Rice community who have contributed published works to the arts, sciences, and humanities in 2020. After recognizing each honoree, we will introduce our panelists for the evening, and Professor Hense will moderate a discussion of our theme for the evening, Building Houston Society and Architecture. We will then open the floor to questions and answers from the audience under the weird conditions of COVID, which many of us have learned to deal with after almost a year of teaching under these conditions. So now I'm going to share my screen with you, and those of you who haven't enjoyed this experience, it's truly mind-altering. I'm kidding. Okay, now we can see Fondren Library, I hope. In previous years, I've asked every honoree to stand up and be recognized. Of course, that would be kind of silly to do right now. You're free to stand up and be recognized if you want, but of course, none of us will see you, and we'll be happy nonetheless. In any case, we have a lot of people who've done pretty amazing things despite the conditions of this past year. I'd like to run through them. We're giving you as much time as I possibly can so we can have our second part of the event. These first honorees are those who have written or who have edited a book. Quite a few this year. My colleague Lisa Bonlar, her amazingly written book, written up actually in the Financial Times, The Emperor Jahangir, Power and Kingship in Mughal India. Congratulations, Lisa. Catherine Savage Brosman, 55, Chain Tree, Chained Owls, Poems, and she also has a second book, Mississippi Poets, A Literary Guide. Congratulations. David M. Beinog, 96, Notes for Violinists, A Guide to the Repertoire. Julie Gineloni Connor, I hope I got the name reasonably correct, pardon me. The Baby with Three Families, Three Countries, and One Promise, International Adoption Story, very important this year of nationalism. David Cook, my colleague from Religious Studies, or Religion, pardon me, called Religion now, Chronicles of Kalawam and his son Al-Ashraf Khalil, and also another translation, Baybar's successor, hold on just a second, Ibn al-Firat on Kalawan and Al-Ashraf. Congratulations, David. Very interesting looking books. Stephen DeLay, Rice 2013, Before God, Exercises in Subjectivity. Luis Duno Gochberg in Spanish Studies, Spanish Language Studies, with Saka Drake, Chris Garces, and Andres Atiano, Carceral Communities in Latin American Troubling Prison Worlds in the 21st Century, a new research endeavor for him. Elaine Howard Eklund, I saw you were here. Thanks for your comment just a moment ago. Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear, a book that has gotten actually a good deal of attention. Stephen Fox, from whom we will hear more shortly, with Barry Scardino Bradley and Michelangelo Sabatino, Making Houston Modern, The Life and Architecture of Howard Barnstone. And 3 works by Gisela Jefes, again in Spanish and Latin American Studies, Cocodrilos en la Noche, The Mobile Zero of Its Mouth, El Cerro Móvil de su Boca, and with Jennifer French, the Latin American Eco-Cultural Reader, a really important year for Jefes making some important interventions in both poetry and talking about ecology and culture. Matthias Hense, a name you've already heard, with Rodney Werling, Early Judaism and its Modern Interpreters. Congratulations. The other person for our discussion in a few minutes here, Stephen Kleinberg, Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America. And many of us have been following his work for a long time, so it's great to see this book come out. Greg Marshall, a book on the Baker Shakespeare Semi-Centennial, 1970 to 2020, a book I'm looking forward to looking at, actually. Anna Mariano, 2013, Love, Sugar, Magic, a Mixture of Mischief. And also a different kind of book for preteens and teens, This Is How We Fly, which is an interesting children's book or teenage book set here in Houston. Brian Ogren, Kabbalah in America, Ancient Lore in the New World. My old friend Bob Patton, who's getting grumpier in his old age. Behind the Scenes, Publishing About Dickens in Hard Times, the Culture and Politics of Academic Publishing. And Bob, I haven't seen you in far too long. Nan Shuxian and Richard Smith, along with Bawai Zhang, Re-examining the Sinosphere, Cultural Transmissions and Transformations in East Asia. This is one of two books that those folks have authored. The other one being Rethinking the Sinosphere, Poetics, Aesthetics, and Identity Formation. Very exciting new work from my old friends, Nanju and Rich Smith. Kim Ricker and Carl Olson, A Sudden Selector's Guide to Geography and GIS. I hope at this point you're all standing up because it's such a long list. You need to get the Pilates moves in. Judith Roof, Tone, Writing and the Sound of Feeling. There's been a lot of discussion now of this notion of sound, both in Germany and the United States. And I think it sounds like a very interesting book. Mark Ryan, The Spider's Way, An Introduction to Jonathan Edwards College at Yale University. Leslie Contreras Schwartz, Who Speaks for Us Here? Christopher Sperandio's book, a graphic novel, Pinko Joe. And also Fundamental Camarena, which I have to admit is one of my wife's most beloved books that she read last year, which she's gifted to other people as well. Jesus Vasallo, Epics in the Everyday, Photography, Architecture, and the Problem of Realism. Laura Wildenthal and Jean Quadert, The Rutledge History of Human Rights, which is big enough to kill a horse. Edward E. Williams and John Dobelman, A Random Walk to Nowhere, How the Professors Caused a Real Fraud on the Market. Interesting title. Kerry Wolfe's Ecological Poetics, or Wallace Stevenson's Birds, from the English department. And finally, in this list of books, Patricia Wynne, 1972, Private Ends, part of the Blue Satan Mystery Series. Congratulations to all the authors. And we'll move on to now those who have been editing in journals. And I think that it's sometimes not apparent, if you're not in the library watching these people spending their lives in the library, how much time it takes to edit a journal, to put these journals together, which are really the building blocks upon which everything else in academia is built. So thank you to all of you in advance. Leslie Marie Aguilar, who's is the managing editor of the SEL, the Studies in English Literature. We have several other people to mention from SEL today. Elizabeth Brake, the school, pardon me, in the journal, with the Journal of Applied Philosophy. Logan Browning, publisher and executive editor of SEL. Joe Campana, who seems to do everything all at once, editor for the earlier period of Studies in English Literature, also involved with ecological study or environmental studies this year. Stephen Kroll in philosophy, working on Husserl studies. Patricia DeLucia, Human Factors, which is a journal related to psychology and ergonomics. Christian Emden, who's an editor with the well-known Nietzsche-Studien, or Nietzsche Studies. A very important journal that's been running, I don't know, over a century. A relatively new hire, Sophie Esch, has edited a special dossier in Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, passages, roots of migration and memory in Central American literature. Benjamin Gibson, editing Physical Review C. Our good friend Randall Hall, in my department of history, editing Journal of Southern History. I should say this year, actually, this past year, he has been spelled by Faye Yarbrough, who took over for a year so that he could get work done on a new book, which I hope we'll be talking about next year. Randy Martin, editing Cognition, International Journal of Cognitive Science. Alexander Regier, again with SEL. And we already mentioned Kerry Wolfe with his book on Wallace Stevens, editor of Post-Humanities. Congratulations to all of you. From here, we turn to those who have been editing, or who have been composing musical works. Stephen Bachicha, I hope I got the name pronounced right, City Moves, graduate 2011. Anthony Brandt, whom we saw a few years ago here in this forum, Cassandra, a chamber opera in 5 scenes. Larry Lesser, 1986, Sparks, an album, calls him Poet Lariat, interesting. And then finally, we come to several one-person art shows, which are worth mentioning. First, from Lena Deb, who presented, I think, 2 years ago, Sounds of Tomorrow, The Oracle Tree. Liz Galvez, in Immaterial Space. And Lisa Lipinski, Drunk Hawking, a 20-year survey exhibit. Michael Petrie, The Landscape of the Gods. So before I give these special thanks, I want to know, this is really an impressive list of things that's happened that have been reported to us. And I hope that most of you have been able to come to know how important it is for the Rice community to see the breadth of work that's happening related to culture, the arts, humanities, science, engineering, I mean, across the board here. Special thanks to David Beinog and Jacob Duff, who helped put this presentation together. And of course, Mary Lowry, I'll thank her again a little bit later on. She's been essential in making it possible for us to actually have the pictures up there. Let's give a positive shout out to COVID for giving us the opportunity to really focus on these images. It's been great. Okay, so to all of our honorees, we extend our congratulations, our thanks. We now move on to the panel discussion. A few words about how we're organizing it this year. Many of us who have been teaching have been forced into the world of online communication. Some of you might not have been. Because we're operating under COVID conditions, we're going to run the question and answer session a little bit differently. As you may know, these are programs, Zoom programs are both open to the public and closed to the public. You have a certain way to get in. We found, unfortunately, very early on that people from outside who were hostile for one reason or another were coming in and kind of violating our security at the public events. I personally, in a class, experienced suddenly my screen being taken over and some kind of symbol being etched. I stopped the class in order to stop the process. Sadly, this is the world that we're living at, which is not very pleasant right now. For that reason, we're going to organize the question and answer for this segment a little bit differently. You'll see at the bottom of your screen something that looks like one speech balloon on top of another and says Q&A. As you hear the two respondents talk to Matthias Hense, you should be able to click on that button to write a question, which I will receive, and I'll read as many questions as we have time for at the end of this discussion. I appreciate your bearing with us. Try out the Q&A, make sure it works. That's fine with me. I'll be monitoring it. This is unfortunately just a part of the reality of teaching and working under COVID. With that, let me yield the floor to my colleague, Matthias Hense, who will moderate the discussion. Matthias?
Thank you, Carl. Excuse me. Thank you. That was a fabulous slideshow. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So let me say hello to everyone and a very good evening. My name is Matthias Henze. I'm a professor in the religion department here at Rice, and I also serve as the director of the program in Jewish Studies. I am thrilled to be hosting this evening again this year with my dear friend Carl Caldwell. Tonight we honor the outstanding accomplishments of our colleagues at Rice, all the fabulous authors and editors, composers and artists. It is a great pleasure to recognize their most recent publications and artistic expressions. Wasn't that a great slideshow? As Carl mentioned, we are meeting tonight under the most unusual circumstances. This is not the format any of us would have chosen. The pandemic has isolated us from each other. And isn't it one of the most wonderful parts of our Rice community that we are a community, that we love to come together, to be with and learn from each other? So for me, during these months of isolation, books were a lifeline. Music and art took on a new meaning. Tonight, therefore, to me is very special. The celebration of creative minds and prolific writers, of researchers and producers of knowledge, of fact finders and those who explain the world to us, of those who give us hope and meaning, and yes, some entertainment too. And I'm ever more grateful to my colleagues for the many wonderful things they continue to produce to make this troubled world a better place. When Carl and I started to think about whom to invite to be on tonight's panel, we came up with two rules. First, their first name had to be Stephen, though we were prepared to make an exception for female panelists. And the second rule, we were particularly interested in our local history, that is, in the city of Houston. I am so thrilled about our two panelists tonight. Now, if I were to do justice to them and introduce them appropriately, that is, to list all their publications and go through all of their accomplishments, I would have to use up the entire time that we have, and our friendship, which I cherish very much, would undoubtedly come to a sudden and abrupt end. And so I beg your pardon if I keep this introduction very brief. Professor Stephen Kleinberg joined Rice's sociology department in 1972 as an associate professor. He is the founding director of Rice's Kinder Institute for Urban Research. In 1982, Professor Kleinberg and his team initiated an annual study that tracks the remarkable changes in economic outlooks, demographic patterns, experiences, and beliefs of local Houstonians. That study is now known as the Kinder Houston Area Survey. Remarkably, it is now in its 40th year. Its annual release here in the city of Houston is always a major event in town. Professor Kleinberg has won 12 major teaching awards, and if I may add on a more personal level, he has been a very dear senior colleague to me over my years at Rice. Tonight, he will talk about his recently published book, Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America. Our second panelist, Stephen Fox, is an architectural historian and a lecturer at the Rice School of Architecture. He is also a lecturer at the Gerald D. Hines College of Architecture of the University of Houston and a fellow of the Anchorage Foundation of Texas. Stephen's work is focused on architecture of the 19th and 20th century, especially the architecture of Houston and Texas. In his scholarship, he examines the ways that architecture engages social constructs such as class identity, cultural distinction, and regional differentiation. He is author and editor of many books and articles. Tonight, we invited him to speak about his recent, beautifully produced book, Making Houston Modern, The Life and Architecture of Howard Barnstone. Let me begin, dear panelists, by thanking you for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate your taking the time to be with Friends of Fondren Library. And most importantly, congratulations to both of you on the publication of your important books. So if I may, I would like to begin our conversation with you, Professor Kleinberg. Thank you again for being here.
Matthias, thank you. I'm honored to be a part of this tremendous group of productive effort that has gone into all of this wonderful work that everyone's doing.
Great, great. Before we get to your book, and obviously that'll be the main part of our conversation, just out of curiosity, may I ask you what made you launch the Kinder Houston Area Survey?
Well, it fell to my lot back in 1982 to teach a research methods class of sociology majors at Rice. We were thinking of doing a survey of freshmen and seniors and then maybe following it up a couple of years later. And a good friend of mine had just started a new survey organization. We thought, why don't we try to study Houston? Houston was booming. 1 million people moved into the city between 1970 and 1982. A city world famous for having imposed the least amount of controls on development of any city in the Western world. Who cares if it's ugly? So what if it smells? It's the smell of money. So we did a one-time survey to measure how are people experiencing this tremendous growth with growing concerns about pollution, crime, traffic. What kind of city are we building with all this affluence? One-time survey, never occurred to us to do it again. 2 months later, the oil boom collapsed. Houston went into the worst regional recession of any part of the country, and then emerged into the 21st century, basically, into no longer counter-cyclical, but now more and more a model of what all of America was becoming.
Yes.
So, and it was partly because of Rice and the wonderful undergraduate students who worked with me each year in a course that we taught that really made it possible to do this. And who knew that Houston would turn out to be the most interesting city in America?
Yes, yes. So with let us turn to your wonderful book, A Prophetic City. So for those of us who have not read it yet, can you tell us a little bit about what it's all about and what you're doing in the book?
You bet. Well, so 3 big changes, right, that epitomize what's happening across all of the country. Nowhere more clearly seen or more sharply articulated than in Houston. One was the loss of the good blue-collar jobs. The big employers in Houston in the 1970s was Hughes Tool Company, Cameron Iron Works. 80% of all the jobs in Houston were tied into the price of oil. Price of oil increased tenfold in value. Houston was booming. Suddenly now a new world where blue-collar jobs disappeared, growing inequalities across the board, predicated above all else on access to quality education. Theme number 2, during the oil boom years, it was Anglos poured into the city from everywhere else in the country. This is where the jobs were. After 1982, the Anglo population of Harris County stopped growing. And all the growth of this, the most rapidly growing city in America, has been the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, and this biracial southern city, dominated and controlled throughout all of its history by white men, has become the single most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the country, where all of America is going to look like Houston looks in about 25 years. This is where, in an important way, the American future is being worked out. And the other piece, of course, is that 80% of the jobs are tied into oil in the during the first 8 decades of the 20th century. Now more and more, the medical center, and can Houston become the 3rd coast for the life sciences, along with Boston and San Francisco, needing to lead the energy transition into a post-carbon world that is being formed. It has to happen now at this point in human history. And the new effort to recognize that the source of wealth in the 21st century will have less to do with natural resources, which was the basis for the wealth of Houston and Texas, and more to do with human resources, with knowledge and skills. So it's really, Houston has turned out to be really a very interesting sort of mirror of what's happening across all of the country. Nowhere, as I say, more clearly seen than Houston. Pure luck, pure serendipity. Never occurred to me to be a student of Houston. And it's a tribute to Rice, I think, and to the support that I got from students and faculty across the board in being able to track this remarkable city over that number of years.
I think many of us have this experience. We come here don't really quite know what to expect, and then we fall in love with the place and discover it. So I think
That's
you're
right. It's
absolutely,
very typical. Yeah.
exactly, you're pointing something out that many of us can relate to. There's so much I love about the book that I would love to discuss with you. One aspect that stood out for me is that you're not simply producing a scientific study about Houston, but it really mattered to you that Houstonians themselves have a voice in the book. You model this from the beginning on. You start out on a very personal note. You talk about your own background, but then throughout the book, there are lots of voices that you bring in that really, for me at least, brought the book to life. It's not just a list of statistics, as important as statistics are, but it's you honoring the people by giving them a voice. And I wanted to give you a shout out for that. I thought that was one of the really compelling parts of the book. It also leads me to a question, namely, how do you get your data? Where do you get your information from? How do you do that?
Right. So I do think of this book as a story of Houston told by the people of Houston.
Yes.
Both by the interviews that we did with kind of key people. Could easily have interviewed another 60 other people, and similarly this sense of Houston is constructed and made by the people who live here and are
Yes.
coping with the challenges and opportunities.
Yes.
And then of course a systematic survey reaching 1,000 people from the 4 million who live in Harris County, and giving what's called the equal probability of selection method so that everyone has an equal chance, and then identical questions asked over time of a sample of that sort that gives us an opportunity to watch the changes going on in people's understandings of the world. What I love about the surveys is that I can tell people, wait, don't blame me, I'm just asking the questions. Here are the answers. Here's how people are answering these questions differently. They are seeing and understanding different things today. And we're a different folk today than we were 10 and 20 years ago. And the data sort of picked that up. So it's a nice combination, as you say. Thank you very much for noticing that, of both the qualitative and the quantitative data that give a much richer picture overall of what's happening.
It makes all the difference in the world, I think. Do you ever hear back from the people to whom you talk? Do they ever see your work and say, "Oh, this is great"?
Some. I get complaints. But of course, the sad thing for all of us is that these books are coming out during the midst of this pandemic.
Yes.
Expecting to be doing book tours all over the country and
Yes.
talking. No one is sending me anywhere. I'm just sitting here in my quarantine world. So
Yes. Yes.
hasn't been the kind. But I get wonderfully spontaneous emails from people who've read the book, and not everybody's entirely happy about it. And it ends up really with a question. It's not clear to me that Houston is going to do the things it needs to do to
Yes.
ensure its success in the 21st century.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
That's an interesting sort of. The jury is out. The jury is out for America as well as for Houston.
Yeah. You call Houston right at the beginning this quintessentially American city, and I quite like that. Can you talk about that? What you mean by that?
Well, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think that Houston was more than anywhere else the American city believing in free enterprise, minimum government.
Mm-hmm.
We Houstonians proclaimed ourselves to be the epitome of what Americans can achieve when left unfettered by zoning, government regulation, excessive taxation. This was free enterprise par excellence, exaggerating the traits that were true across all of America. And then, and of course, we congratulated ourselves. We thought we were booming in the 70s because we had a superior free enterprise philosophy. Mm-hmm. Turned out to have a whole lot more to do with our location in the East Texas oil fields. Mm-hmm. And when the oil bust occurred in 1982, Houston was suddenly finding that its future now depends on collective decisions and commitments today. Our riding of the oil boom that gave us, they used to say in the 70s, you could dress a gorilla in a business suit, send him downtown, and he'd become a millionaire in a week. That sort of automatic success is now much more up to us, up to the community as a whole, to make the investments that are needed to position Houston for prosperity in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You not only call Houston the quintessentially American city, but a little later you also call it a paradoxical city. What makes it what are the paradoxes that you see here?
So the biggest paradox is the growing recognition on the part of people across the board, and also all the people we were talking of the critical necessity, for example, to invest in education, to invest in preschool education, especially to ensure that every child gets access to quality education between birth and college, between cradle and career, because that's how you find a job. That's how you contribute to and are prepared to be in a position to find a job that can support a family in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century. We understand that. But the paradox is we haven't figured out how to make it happen.
Yes.
And Houston is behind both San Antonio and Dallas in its ability to ensure that kids from poor families get access to quality education. And we know that it's one of the moments of truth in American education is third grade reading. If you're not reading at third grade level in third grade, you are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. And the single most powerful predictor whether you can read at third grade level is, did you start kindergarten ready to learn to read? Rich kids in Houston start kindergarten 1.5 to 2 years ahead of poor kids. That's a critical challenge. And we know that, we understand it, but we're not able yet to figure out a way to bring the resources to bear to ensure that we can make those changes at a time when the demographics have been just profound, right? It's not until you reach people age 63 and older that the majority of folks are Anglos in Houston. And at each younger age group, the percentage of Anglos plummets, percentage of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians surges. Of everybody in Harris County, Texas, under the age of 20, 51% are Latinos, 19% are African American, 9% are Asians, 21% of everybody under 20 is Anglo. So there's the future. We know that's who we are and will be in the 21st century. I tell people no force in the world will stop Houston or Texas or America from becoming more African American, more Asian, more Latino, and less Anglo. And this transformation can be the greatest asset that Houston could have as it positions itself in the global economy, or it could tear us apart.
You know,
that's a critical moment that the city faces.
There's so many statistics in the book that really blew me away, and that was the single one that stood out for me. The lines that crossed, and exactly as you say, the younger generation, the non-Hispanic whites were clearly in the minority. And you say that, you write so beautiful, no war, no stopping of immigration will ever reverse that trend. It's quite remarkable that you say this is going to happen and political conviction plays no role. This is the future. So you just said a second ago that Houston is behind other cities. Why is that, behind San Antonio in education?
Well, Houston is maxed out in its taxes, in both the sales tax and the property tax and the sales tax. We're at the maximum that we can go. There is no income tax, of course. These are regressive taxes, and they also and so San Antonio was able to add 0.5 cent on its sales tax earmarked for preschool education. We can't do that, and we're locked into limitations established by the Texas legislature. And we do a lot of volunteering. We've got a wonderful philanthropic community in the city that has made enormous contributions, as we all know. But you're not going to make it if you don't have sustained source of income that comes from a program where taxes are earmarked in that way. And that's the paradox, that we're not yet able, as successfully as other cities in Texas, and especially other cities across the country, in doing what we know we need to do if Houston is going to succeed. And it's that translation from understanding to action, and to a willingness on those of us who have been privileged in the city to be willing to pay a little higher taxes in order to ensure that not just my kids will make it, but that Houston's kids are prepared to succeed.
Yeah. That also became very clear to me from reading through your book, the importance of education and the importance of giving everybody a share in the classroom and the opportunity, a fair shot at getting a high quality education. So shall we look to the future a little bit? I will not ask you to pull out your crystal ball and tell us where Houston will be. But I did want to ask you, when we look to the future of Houston, what is it that you're looking for? What are trends that worry you? What are your aspirations for our city?
Well, we've touched on many of those already. I end the book, as you know, this statement, the jury is out,
Yes.
not just for Houston, but for America. It's,
Yes.
it's and you know, this is a kind of a more optimistic time at the moment. We're going to come out of this pandemic, and there are some things we can say with absolute certainty about the future, especially demographics. Right? I can tell you with total confidence that the percentage of the population that will be African American, Latino, and Asian is going to increase. The percentage that will be Anglo will decrease. We're in the midst of this extraordinary kind of transition, as you were suggesting, where the baby boom generation, 76 million babies born in that incredible period after World War II, between 1946 and 1964. Leading edge turned 75 this year. Overwhelmingly Anglo babies, heading off into the proverbial sunset, being replaced by a very different generation of Americans. That we can say. What we can't say yet is, will we take the actions to ensure that African American Latino kids, especially, who will be 70% of everybody in Harris County under the age of 20, will be the workers and citizens and voters and taxpayers of Houston in the 21st century. Can we say with confidence they will be prepared to succeed? The answer is no, you can't say that with confidence. And so we're in an interesting moment, it seems to me, when more than probably ever before, the future of this community depends on the commitments and determination of the people in this community to say, I believe, you know, as you were saying earlier, the story of Houston is that most people came here reluctantly. Yuck, the job is here, we'll go for a couple of years, then we'll go to some real place. And then discovering this is a wonderful, in our surveys, people complain about traffic, pollution, crime, the hot summers, the no mountains, the flying cockroaches. Then we said, well, how would you rate the Houston area as a place to live? It's a wonderful place to live. Just overwhelmingly, people love it here, believe in this city. Can we translate that into sustained investment that ensures, and education is a big thing, but it's also quality of life. We're making a much more beautiful and interesting city. We have extraordinary art and music. All of that is very important in building the Houston future.
I was going to say, in the 23 years or so that I've been here, I've seen enormous changes in Houston for the better, particularly as far as the communities go, the quality of life, lots of things that are happening.
Green spaces, parks,
Exactly.
The arts, the new Museum of Fine Arts Houston is just extraordinary with that, what the kids have done there. And we believe it. We love the city, and we think we get a bum rap in the rest of the country. We probably do. So this, but the jury is out. I mean, I think it's hard to say what Houston will be. You can develop different scenarios for what Houston will be, but it's hard not to be ultimately optimistic about Houston. Just, you know, in our surveys, again, you watch the sort of shifts going on that are, you know, this embrace of the diversity in this city, this recognition that this city is so much richer because of you know, who knew that Houston would turn out to be the most ethnically diverse city in the country? This is, no one planned that. And there's that embrace of it and that recognition of the enormous enrichment that this brings to all of us. That is interesting to see in the surveys and give some reason for optimism as we look forward.
And you also say that Houston is now what the United States will be in a few decades, right?
All of America, the census has a projection for what the American population will look like in 2050.
Yes.
And Houston's population today.
Yes.
By 2050, all of America will look like Houston looks.
Yes.
And we're here first. So this is where, for better or worse, the American future is going to be worked out.
Right.
And it's, again, who knew? No one planned this. No one said, let's become the most ethical, let's be what America will. And it's a really powerful kind of sense of, that's why this city matters.
Yes.
And that's why we, as we work to build a better city for Houston, we are a model for what all of America can be. And it's an important piece of why this matters and why people need to pay more attention, and why those of us who live in Houston need to recognize that the future is ours to develop and to build.
Will the Houston area surveys continue in the future?
Yes.
Yes.
What are you?
I'm asking.
It's only been 40 years. I was a very young man.
Barely begun. Yes.
So we have brought into the Kinder Institute a wonderful guy who's worked for 20 years with the Rand Corporation, is very eager to get back into academia. And he's coming to work with me this year on the survey, and then I'm going to work with him next year. And he's so It's a wonderful sense. Yes, this is well, it's turned out there's no other city in America that has been tracked in this way, this systematic way for all these years.
Right,
And no city has undergone the kind of changes that Houston has. So we want
right.
to, it's worth making sure that it continues. And it will, it's in very good hands, as you'll see, as you get to know Robert Bozick, who's joining us at the Kennedy Center.
Fantastic. Surely there are other cities who are imitating this model, who are following your lead, who are doing similar things by now or not?
Well, we've worked with Atlanta, we've worked with Dallas. It's hard to get people realize how valuable this is after 3 or 4 years of the surveys.
Yeah,
A
yeah, yeah, yeah,
one-time survey, is that
yeah.
up or down? Is that high or low? And watching it over time. And when we started this was a undergraduate course at Rice, and the students did all the interviews, and
Yes, yes,
we got that wonderful grant for teaching innovations, and
yes.
with $1,800 we're able to pay for the telephones, and now it's a very expensive and difficult, much more difficult. In the old days,
Yeah.
everyone had landline phones. The phone rings, you answer the damn phone,
Mhm.
and now it's a more complicated and more difficult process of.
Of
So it
course.
takes some advanced monies and we're hoping that that this book and that experience will urge other students. And enormously valuable to have an objective snapshot. We all have impressions of what's happening, but to
Mhm.
see the changes, to see that people today understand education differently, clearly differently than they did 10 years ago, in terms of the belief that we got all the money we need to spend, it's being wasted, to it's in order for Houston to provide a quality education, significantly more money will be needed. And there's a
Yeah.
recognition of that today that was not there 10 years ago. Can we translate that into action is the great question, as we're touching on.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful note on which to close out. I'm so glad to hear that Rice made such a big difference and really was such a fabulous platform for you to do your research and enabled you to do your research in the beginning.
Right.
So thank you for joining us again and congratulations on your wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And do stay tuned. Obviously, there will be questions for you from the audience, I hope. And you should also feel free to jump in with my next conversation partners. Stephen, may I ask you to turn on your, oh, there you are. Hi.
Hello.
So I would like to start out. Please allow me by judging your book by its cover and point out what an incredibly beautiful book it is. It really struck me that the University of Texas Press did a marvelous job with all the photos, many of them historic. My personal favorite was Howard Barnstone lecturing inside Rothko Chapel to, I think, architecture students. The layout, the appendixes, it's just a beautifully produced book. Um,
Thank
so
you very much.
yeah, it's wonderful. Um, Let me ask you a broad question at the beginning, namely, what made you want to put together a beautiful book like this on Howard Barnstone?
Well, I worked for Howard Barnstone for 3 years
Mhm,
in the late 1970s after I graduated from the Rice School of Architecture.
mhm,
I actually worked for him not in his architecture studio, although I was literally there, but helping him produce a book, the second of the two books that he wrote about the Houston architect John F. Staub.
mhm.
And over the course of those 3 years, I came to appreciate the distinctive uh, aspects of Howard Barnstone's personality. He
Mhm.
was extremely clever, witty, charming, at least on his good days, as well as a talented architect, someone who really managed to do an amazing number of things. He was also a professor of architecture at the University of Houston, and a kind of well-known gadfly in Houston whenever anyone from the media wanted a provocative quotation, they would always call Howard Barnstone. Uh, and Barnstone really had this great way of imprinting himself on the people that he was around. And he was bipolar, so I think that was part of the kind of charge of his personality, but it also meant that he had good days and bad days. And when he died in 1987, he killed himself when he was in the midst of prolonged depression. And that was something that he often talked about. His father had committed suicide. So the people around him knew that this was always a possibility, but it never seemed like it would come to pass until it did come to pass. And I think the people around Howard Barnstone who appreciated him felt this kind of tremendous obligation to document his not just his career, and he was a very important architect in Houston, but also his life because he was such an extraordinary personality. Uh, the late Houston architect Bill Stern had proposed in the early 2000s that a group of people who knew Howard get together and put together a book about him. Unfortunately, Bill Stern himself died. But Michelangelo Sabatino, who was then teaching at the University of Houston, and Barry Scardino Bradley, an architectural historian who from time to time was associated with Rice University, and I kind of took on this task. And rather than one person writing the book, because Howard himself was so multifaceted, it seemed like a great idea to recruit people who could write about the various aspects of his personality and his career. So we were able to assemble a wonderful team. And one of our contributors was thanks to you, Matthias. It's through you that I met Josh Furman, the curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive, who wrote a wonderful chapter about Howard Barnstone in Jewish Houston.
Yes.
So Bruce Webb wrote about Howard Barnstone in the University of Houston. Olive Hershey wrote the most entertaining chapter in the book about Howard and his wife, Gertrude Barnstone. Gertrude was a 1945 graduate of the Rice Institute and a very important and celebrated personality in her own right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, that's quite a prehistory to the book and how it came about. You've mentioned all your wonderful contributors. Let me add to that you yourself have written both the first chapter of the book, in which you describe the architectural styles of Howard Barnstone, and you have co-authored the 7th chapter titled A Short Biography. And I wanted to come back to something that you said about his tragic death earlier on. One of the many aspects that I really admired about the book is its honesty. You tell a story, and to me at least, it seemed like you're not brushing over anything. It's a wonderful and honest portrayal of the man. And so I obviously had never met him. I knew nothing about him. And having read your book, I come away as a reader as having a pretty good impression of who this remarkable architect was. So I really enjoyed that about the book. In the introduction, you quote from a eulogy of Barnstone, in which the author points to his, and I quote, enthusiastic defense of the new Houston. So I was wondering, could you compare to us Howard Barnstone with other Houston architects of his time?
Well, I was reviewing Steve Kleinberg's book, Prophetic City, and I was struck by how many of the chapter titles could be applied to Howard Barnstone's life. And it seemed that the city that Steve Kleinberg encountered when he came to Houston was really Howard Barnstone's Houston. Barnstone had come to Houston in 1949 as a recent graduate, sorry, 1948, as a recent graduate of Yale University. And he kind of got here by accident because he was driving cross country and his car broke down. So he came to Houston while it was being repaired. But then he actually had an aunt who lived in Houston, and Her daughter had also attended Rice in the 1930s. And then his aunt took him out to the University of Houston, which had just recently started an architecture program. And Howard made such an impression on the director of UH's architecture program, who was also a Rice graduate, that at least as Howard told it, he was hired on the spot. And he said that he thought he would remain in Houston a year or two and then go back to Maine, where he was born. Um, but instead, like like I think most of the rest of Houston, he ended up spending his whole life here, and then of course contributing to the formation of a distinctive modern culture in Houston through his architecture in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, but then also as this kind of extraordinary personality who didn't really conform to any particular typology of the way that people are supposed to behave. One of the chapter titles that you've already mentioned for Steve's book is Paradoxical City.
Yes, yes.
Howard loved to play the paradoxical provocateur. What he especially loved was everything that was bad about Houston. Uh, Air conditioning, cars, and architects always profess to hate air conditioning and cars. And then above all, no zoning. In the third of Houston's, I guess, five zoning wars of the 20th century in 1962, Howard shocked all of his liberal cohorts by coming out very strongly and very publicly against zoning. And the same kind of ideology that Steve Kleinberg talks about was one that Howard Barnstone professed, but not in a kind of reactionary or conservative context, but always in a progressive context, and suggesting that that's what made Houston such a liberating city.
Wonderful. So you mentioned several of the chapters. There's one that we haven't yet mentioned and that I particularly liked, namely the chapter about Howard Barnstone and the Mcdaniels. And there are some beautiful, beautiful photographs in there as well. Can you talk a little bit about their relationship and the art scene in general and how people responded to Barnstone?
Certainly. I first of all must pay tribute to the author of that chapter, Barry Bradley, who did a tremendous amount of archival research, both in Howard Barnstone's papers and in the Mcdaniel archives, to put together this very comprehensive account of Howard Barnstone's relationship with Dominique and John de Mcdaniel, and then many of the people who were connected with them. And just as the Second World War brought the Mcdaniels to Houston from Paris, and again, I think with the expectation that when the war was over, that they would go back to Paris. Instead, they too ended up spending their lives here. And John de Mcdaniel was especially good at sort of spotting talent. And he and Howard Barnstone sort of hit it off from the beginning of their acquaintanceship. And John de Mcdaniel was Howard Barnstone's great patron. And whereas some people, I guess, especially very conventional people, would be put off by Howard Barnstone because he did espouse unconventional opinions. John de Mcdaniel loved that. And he trusted Howard Barnstone and gave him so many opportunities, not only kind of personal work for Dominique and John de Mcdaniel, but a lot of work from the Schlumberger Corporation, with which John de Mcdaniel was associated. Of course, it was founded by Mrs. de Mcdaniel's father and uncle. And then referrals to the Friends of the Mcdaniels, institutions in Houston and beyond, including, of course, Howard Barnstone and Eugene Aubrey's design of the Rice Museum and the Media Center, which were built in 1969-70 at the same time as the Rothko Chapel. And whereas the Rothko Chapel was actually Barnstone and Aubrey's reworking of a design by Philip Johnson, and Howard Barnstone was always very clear about the fact that he was not the originating architect for the Rothko Chapel. Barnstone and Aubrey did design the Rice Museum and Media Center, the art barn, these sort of metal-clad buildings on the very edge of the Rice campus, where so much of what was extraordinary in art and media, film, photography that occurred in Houston in the 1970s and 1980s happened. So it was not only that these were very distinctive buildings, but they were also incubators for the kind of talent that Dominique and John Demeniel loved to kind of encourage. And I think Howard Barnstone's association with these extraordinary personalities uh, uh, began a kind of synergistic effect to again evolve Houston's culture in ways that Steve Kleinberg was talking about, so that you sort of talk in terms of these general trends. But I think with Howard Barnstone and Dominique and John Demeniel, you really kind of focus on the people who made these transformations happen.
You mentioned already the chapter on Gertrude Levy, or Gertrude Barnstone, which I thought was a great chapter. Can you talk about her a little bit?
Certainly, Gertrude Barnstone was a Houstonian. She was born in 1925 in Houston. Her parents were from the Northeast. Like Howard Barnstone's mother and father, Gertrude's mother and father were the children of European Jewish immigrants to the United States. So in the kind of three short generations, sort of one went from these immigrants um, to, in case of Gertrude's father, he was a petroleum engineer, a chemical engineer. He worked for the Texas company. And uh, as Olive Hershey writes, Gertrude's mother was sort of a kind of frustrated artist who pushed her daughter headway into first a career in acting, then in art. She according to Olive Hershey, Gertrude and her mother had a very tense relationship, but it was always because Gertrude's mother was pushing her to be ever more creative and unconventional. In fact, I was able to find a wonderful photograph of Gertrude as a 14-year-old doing a play reading with William Goyen, which she was in published, I think, in the Houston Chronicle.
Mhm.
Gertrude was a quite extraordinary person, just as extraordinary as Howard. Howard loved society, and I'm glad that you called this presentation Houston City and Society, because um, Howard kind of gravitated to this sort of upper class WASP milieu. Gertrude, by virtue of growing up in Houston and just going to the right public schools, actually had access to this milieu, which she was very blasé about. She would just as soon, I think, spend her time with fellow artists and actors rather than in River Oaks. And so, what was fascinating about Howard and Gertrude's relationship was that there were these kind of powerful forces pulling them together: their inventiveness, their intelligence, their singularity. But there were equally powerful forces, as Olive Hershey writes, driving them apart, and that they were two very strong individuals whose I think particularly Howard's desire to control Gertrude kind of created a lot of tension in their lives, and ultimately led to their divorce in 1969, which also corresponded to Howard Barnstone's first major episode of depression. Gertrude
Mm.
Barnstone kind of went on from being Mrs. Howard Barnstone, which is how she was always portrayed when for 5 years she was a trustee of the Houston Independent School District and fought a constant battle against reactionary forces, and especially to desegregate the Houston Independent School District. She went on to become a major spokesperson for women's rights and other kind of progressive causes through the rest of her long life. She died at the age of 95 2 years ago.
This book is just
Wow.
filled with amazing stories, and your chapters tell these stories so very, very well. You have another book come out in a couple of months about the Rothko Chapel, which you mentioned already. Can you give us a sneak preview of what that book is all about now that the chapel has undergone the renovations?
Certainly. Well, in February next I was going to say next month, next week, the Rothko Chapel will turn 50 years of age.
Wow.
For me, this is a little humbling because I remember going to the Rothko Chapel when it opened, and I was a student at Rice University. Um, the 50th anniversary is being celebrated by the Rothko Chapel. With a kind of transformation of the building. One of the characteristics of the building that was criticized from the day it opened was the skylight. And because of the dedication of Christopher Rothko, the son of the artist Mark Rothko, who has served now for quite a few years on the board of directors of the Rothko Chapel, he and his sister Kate Rothko Prizel, Christopher really made it his desire to finally resolve the problems with the skylight, which have been done. A brilliant design by George Sexton, the lighting designer with ARO Architects, and so to mark this transformation and really not so much restoring the Rothko Chapel, but making it be what it was meant to be. The Rothko Chapel is producing a book about the 50 years of the chapel. I wrote a kind of short chapter on the architecture, but it's accompanied by a longer and a kind of wonderful chapter by Pamela Smart, who is has her PhD from Rice University. She is an anthropologist and wrote a very insightful book about the Menil enterprise called Sacred Modern. And so she has followed up that very substantive book with this specialized essay about the Rothko Chapel, talking not only about the building and the paintings, but also the extraordinary program that was begun by Dominique and John de Menil and then carried on by Mrs. de Menil after Mr. de Menil's death 2 years after the chapel opened.
Wow, I'm very much looking forward to that book. I confess that the Rothko Chapel is one of my favorite places in Houston, and I'm just rejoicing in your book. Thank you for sharing these wonderful stories, very, very rich stories about Houston and Houston's architecture with us. I'm very grateful. So with an eye on the clock, I would like now to turn it back over to Carl, who has been looking at questions from the audience. So Carl, I turn it over to you.
And also with the eye on the clock, we have some good questions, but I realize we don't have all that much time, which always happens here. And usually we can repair to whatever food that Mary has provided for us, and that's not going to happen. So I'll try to do my best. And actually, I have several questions that I think they're addressed to one of you, but they can apply to both of you. The first question is something that neither of you have brought up, has to do with climate change. we're talking about not just the city in its architectural landscape and demography, but also its future. What are the important choices that Houston must make for its sustainability in the 21st century, including flood control and everything? But I believe this is going to address what both of you are doing, but in somewhat different ways. So let's start with Steve Kleinberg.
You bet, Carl. Great question. Well, in our surveys, we've been tracking that, obviously, to some degree. Two key questions you've asked over the years. One was, how serious a problem is global warming? And it went from 30% to 60%, saying very serious. I mean, just really strike. And then even more striking was a question that said, is climate change primarily due to human activities or to natural climate cycles? Oh, sorry for my cat here. And the percent who now recognize that it's human factors that we're responsible for and need to deal with has also grown dramatically. Another question that said, how likely do you think it is that Houston will experience even more severe storms in the next 10 years? Is in the last 10, 73% of the survey this year said they agree that it is virtually certain that Houston will experience more severe. So it is one of the central questions for Houston's future. Either we will, and you can see the sea change that's going on in the world of oil and gas, as well as the rest of us, whether we will lead the transition that is underway now to a post-carbon future, or whether it's just going to pass us by. And we are now the oil and gas capital of the world. Can we become the energy capital? And there's a lot going for Houston, but also a lot of resistance because of, suddenly all those leases that I bought and all that oil that's in the ground, you're telling me I can't produce. So that's one of the great questions and great opportunities for Houston. Houston is better positioned than anywhere else because it's got that expertise. If it can wrap its head around the idea that oil and gas is not going to be the future of Houston or America.
Yes.
Okay. Stephen, what do you?
Well, I'm mindful of the work that's being done here in Rice's School of Architecture, especially by professors Albert Pope and Jesus Vassallo, and Carl, you highlighted Jesus's recent book. So I think the architecture profession is sort of driven by its clients, and it's interesting for me to see how developers have begun marketing their projects based on their environmental performance. And at the same time, institutions such as, particularly Rice University, stands out for its insistence on designing and building new buildings that will kind of perform very economically over the long term. And just as important, and I think it perhaps is not always recognized as such, Rice University's commitment to preserving the buildings that it has, and especially its oldest buildings, the mechanical laboratory and powerhouse, one of the 4 original buildings from 1912, is being restored right now by Rice University. And so this not only designing and building well for the future, but also maintaining and respecting the built environment that we possess already, I think are both sort of hallmarks in Houston's favor.
Here.
Thank you. The next question is a little bit lighter because we're not talking about the end of Houston. If you go up in the tip channel, imagine, anyway, that's just my mind, but I'm going to change the question around a little bit because again, this is a question I think is actually directed to both of you. How are the themes of Professor Kleinberg's book reflected in the architecture of Houston? This is for Stephen Fox. I think probably thinking about dynamism and unzoned development, and specifically asking you, Stephen, where would you take people on a tour of Kleinberg's Houston? Think that. I'm going to ask then Steve Kleinberg to correct Stephen Fox.
Well, actually, I'm going to ask Stephen Kleinberg where I have taken him on tours and his class for many years.
Absolutely. The highlight of my course is a tour with Stephen Fox. And I've learned so much about the city from his descriptions and his experiences. So really very grateful. But go ahead. So how's all this reflected in the architecture?
Well, I think that the I think particularly again, Steve, your chapter heading quality of place makes me focus again on how architecture kind of represents the city. And I would say at the moment, the most interesting work, new work in Houston, new architectural work, is on a small scale. And it is really the traditional patrons of architecture, such as Rice University, the Museum of Fine Arts, the Mcdaniel Collection, that are building institutional buildings that seem adventuresome. And the corporate community, which certainly led the nation in the 1970s and early 1980s when it came to distinctive architecture, is now not so interested in architecture. They don't really see it as kind of adding value to what they do. So for me, that is a little bit disturbing, but I am heartened by the fact that these cultural institutions still feel that it's very important for them to kind of express their commitment to the community through their architectural patronage.
Yeah, Steve and I often have these questions about is it cup half full or half empty? Is it are we moving in which direction? Because there is a growing recognition that if Houston's going to make it in the 21st century, it has to become a destination of choice, a place where the best and the brightest people in America who can live anywhere will say, I want to live in Houston, Texas. And that's a challenge. And what Stephen has shown us is how much of that of the historical architecture is individualistic. There's too little effort to connect to the wider community. So the contrast between the Rice University campus and the Texas Medical Center in terms of institutions that build a kind of a public space and those that don't. And one of the challenges for Houston is to become a more beautiful and attractive place. And we're doing it with parks, but we're not doing it yet with buildings in a way that is going to be interesting to watch as we go forward.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, and unfortunately, we're not going to have time for more questions. Elaine, I apologize. And there was also a question in the chat, which I believe was just answered about the different role of architects in today's city. However, we do have to, like I said, people are allocating a certain amount of time. And so I want to thank both of you very much and thank Matthias for a wonderful job of organizing this panel. We can all clap silently alone. Get used to what it's like to being a professor at Rice, right? Where they laugh and you don't know if they're laughing. I also want to make sure that we thank Mary Lowry for her work tonight. She's done so much work. Every year she does so much work in getting the information together and helping us set this whole thing up. She is, of course, the executive director of the Friends of Fondren group. And so, Mary, thanks so much. And we're glad that you had a year off from dealing with catering. Tonight's event was, of course, presented by Friends of Fondren Library. That's a membership organization that provides financial support to Rice University's Fondren Library and presents lectures and events for our members and for the greater Houston community. And if you aren't already a member, then I would suggest that you consider joining. Mary has just put a link in our chat session. Let me say just a few personal words about the library. Now, of course, I'm in history, Matthias is in religion. Okay, we're book people. But the library isn't just about book people. For book people, the library is something that is sacred. Without that, that is our laboratory. That is where we do work. That's also where Professors Fox and Kleinberg are finding their information, gathering their information. It's also a digital hub, and it's also a place where students come together and do work. This is this heart and soul of the university, and Friends of Fondren has been working very hard to update parts of it, enhance parts of it for new purposes, and so on. So please do consider becoming a member and supporting this really important institution. We also hope that you'll join us for future Friends of Fondren Library events. Our next event will be Books That Shaped My World, basically it's called, on February 4th at 6 p.m. And Mary has just put up a connection to a link to that event. Now, this presentation is going to be co-sponsored by the Baker Institute. It's going to feature my colleague and chair of my department, Caleb Mcdaniel, who, as you may know, won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America, which is simply a wonderful book. It's one of these books you start reading, you can't put down. Caleb will be talking about not only the story that he's presenting there, but also the problem of restitution and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States, which is another history of Houston that we haven't gotten into tonight. Very important part of our surroundings here. It's to be moderated by Alan Matisow, Academic Affairs Director at the Baker Institute, and the William Gaines Twyman Professor Emeritus of History, who hired me. So, gotta go see him. The main thing, I really suggest you see this. Caleb is, the book is wonderful, very important book, and this should be a great presentation. So all this information is available on the Friends of Fondren website. Please feel free to visit. And with that, I'm going to close the show and thank everyone involved. Thank you, Stephen Fox. Thank you, Stephen Kleinberg. Thank you, Matthias. And thank you, Mary. Good night.
Thank you, Carl. Okay. Good night, everybody. Thanks again. Great to be with you.